The Nexus Prime research team was absolutely certain no biological being could survive space's vacuum. Their confidence was built on centuries of galactic science and flawless logic. Then they met Wade, a human who just smiled calmly as they prepared to eject him into the void. What they discovered next shattered every assumption they'd ever held about life, physics, and humanity's place in the cosmos. The Nexus Prime research facility drifted in silent orbit around a gas giant, a pristine temple of galactic science where nothing unpredictable had occurred for 3 generations of lead researchers. Their vacuum exposure protocol followed established biological laws that had remained unchanged for centuries. A framework so universally accepted it occupied the same unquestioned status as gravity or thermodynamics. Every sensor array, every monitoring system, every fail-safe mechanism was calibrated with a singular expectation: to document catastrophic biological failure within seconds of exposure. Their confidence was less a product of arrogance than institutional inertia, the kind that accumulates when generations of scientists confirm the same results using identical methodology. The ejection chamber itself stood as a physical monument to this certainty, a gleaming cylinder of reinforced transparent steel and polished chrome, more ceremonial altar than scientific instrument. It had recorded exactly 4,712 instances of organic tissue succumbing to vacuum exposure, each termination following an almost identical pattern of cellular rupture and systemic collapse. The lead researchers had built entire careers documenting these predictable failures, publishing papers that reinforced the fundamental limitations of biological matter. This particular experiment was meant to be the final, definitive entry in a long sequence of conclusive data points. They had calibrated their instruments to track expected phenomena: the boiling of bodily fluids, the rapid decompression of lung tissue, the spectacular failure of circulatory systems. Their preparations accounted for every variable except one: the possibility that their subject might not follow the established rules. Their entire framework assumed that humanity, like every other species they'd studied, operated within defined biological constraints. They meticulously checked their equipment one final time, ensuring perfect vacuum integrity and optimal sensor alignment. The lead scientist reviewed the protocols with the weary precision of someone who had performed this ritual countless times before. Everything was prepared to record another death. They simply failed to consider they might instead be about to witness a demonstration. Wade presented a puzzle from the moment they brought him aboard the Nexus Prime, a walking contradiction to their entire database of biological behavior. His calm demeanor was the first deviation in their otherwise predictable research logs, an anomaly that should have triggered immediate protocol review, but instead registered as merely curious. He displayed none of the physiological markers of distress they'd documented across thousands of species. No elevated heart rate, no adrenaline spikes, no pupil dilation indicating panic. The man simply sat in his containment field, observing the scientists with the detached curiosity of a museum patron examining mildly interesting exhibits. His smile proved particularly disconcerting to the research team, who had extensive experience with fear-induced grimaces and madness-driven laughter. This was different, a subtle upward curve of the lips that suggested private amusement rather than psychological breakdown. It was the expression of someone who understood a joke the entire room had missed, a quiet confidence that felt decidedly out of place in an execution chamber. For 3 full cycles he maintained this state of relaxed awareness, a statistical impossibility according to every behavioral model in their archives. The scientists did what scientists do when faced with inconvenient data. They rationalized. Senior researcher Zil Mora postulated that Wade's calmness indicated a primitive neural structure incapable of processing imminent danger, while others suggested it might be a form of cultural denial or religious fatalism. They filed these theories as plausible explanations, updating their reports with tentative footnotes about possible psychological limitations in early spacefaring species. This rationalization represented their first critical error in judgment, though they wouldn't recognize it as such until much later. What they failed to comprehend was that Wade's smile wasn't a sign of ignorance, but of recognition. He knew something they didn't about the nature of vacuum exposure, something that transformed their definition of certain death into his natural habitat. The void wasn't a threat to him, it was home territory. While they prepared to document his expiration, he was simply waiting for conditions to become optimal. His calm demeanor wasn't resignation to execution, but the patience of a professional waiting for the right moment to begin his actual work. The ejection chamber wasn't his death sentence, it was his boarding gate. The debate over Wade's fate lasted precisely 4 minutes and 17 seconds. A brisk administrative exercise that barely interrupted the research team's lunch scheduling. Junior ethicist Blixandra raised the mandated procedural question about sentient rights protocols, her voice carrying the tentative tone of someone reading from a manual they hadn't fully internalized. She mentioned Article 14 of the Galactic Research Accord, the one about informed consent and minimizing distress in experimental subjects. Her objection was less a moral stand than a bureaucratic checkbox, the kind of procedural hurdle their civilization maintained for appearances rather than practical. Application. Senior researcher Zilmora dismissed her concern with the weary patience of a scholar, addressing a particularly slow student. He didn't raise his voice or show irritation. Both would have violated laboratory decorum protocols. Instead, he repositioned the ethical question as a mathematical equation, framing morality as an inefficient variable in the purity of data collection. His argument followed flawless internal logic. The knowledge gained from observing a unique biological specimen in vacuum exposure would benefit countless future beings across the galaxy. One individual's potential suffering became statistically insignificant when measured against the exponential value of acquired knowledge. This wasn't cruelty but calculus. Their civilization had perfected this particular blind spot over centuries of academic tradition. The collective advancement of knowledge stood as their highest virtue, a principle so deeply embedded in their culture that individual rights had gradually become administrative formalities rather than genuine constraints. They saw Wade not as a person with thoughts and agency, but as an unprecedented research opportunity, a variable that might finally provide insights into vacuum tolerance mechanisms. His calm demeanor and unusual physiology made him fascinating, not worthy of ethical consideration. The forms were filed, the protocols acknowledged, the box checked. This dismissal of ethics reflected a fundamental failure of imagination rather than malice. Their scientific framework had no mechanism for accounting for a subject who might object to their procedures, not through protest, but through unexpected capabilities. They were so thoroughly focused on documenting biological failure that the possibility of biological triumph never entered their calculations. Their instruments were calibrated to measure death throes, not conscious adaptation. Their entire experimental design assumed a passive subject whose only role was to validate their existing models. The resolution phase lasted 37 seconds, exactly the time allocated for ethical override procedures. Zilmora logged the decision with a crisp tap on his datapad, the sound echoing in the sterile observation chamber. Blixandra made the required notation in the ethics log, her fingers moving with automatic precision. The team returned to their stations, their focus shifting to instrument calibration and data collection protocols. They had satisfied the requirement to consider ethics while remaining free to pursue knowledge without meaningful constraint. Their certainty in their own methodology created the perfect conditions for what was to follow. Not an execution, but an education. They were about to learn that some subjects don't just refuse to die quietly. Some subjects come with lessons prepared. The final moments unfolded with the precision of a well-rehearsed ceremony, each movement calibrated by centuries of institutional routine. The metallic clang of the chamber door ceiling echoed through the sterile laboratory, a sound that had historically served as the definitive period at the end of countless experimental sentences. This particular resonance had concluded exactly 4,112 biological narratives, each ending precisely where the Nexus Prime scientists predicted they would. Monitors flickered to life across the observation deck, their displays painting a deceptively ordinary portrait of Wade's vital signs. His heart rate maintained a steady rhythm, his respiratory functions appeared nominal, his neural activity showed no distress patterns. The data stream looked so thoroughly normal that several researchers double-checked their calibration settings. The automated countdown, commenced with the solemn cadence of a ritual, performed too many times to feel significant anymore. The lead scientist watched the descending numbers with the detached focus of someone confirming that a known process would once again produce known results. They missed the subtle transformation happening within the chamber itself. Wade's posture shifted from relaxed captivity to purposeful readiness, a change so gradual it barely registered on their motion sensors. He didn't assume the defensive curl they'd documented in other species facing vacuum exposure. Instead, he settled into a stance that suggested anticipation rather than dread. His weight distributed evenly, his muscles coiled with controlled potential. The research team interpreted this physical composure through their established framework of biological responses. Senior researcher Zil Mora noted in the log that the subject exhibited cultural or instinctual positioning consistent with end-of-life rituals observed in primitive species. Another scientist speculated that Wade's stance might represent a religious acceptance of imminent death, perhaps a meditation practice from his homeworld. Their analysis remained trapped within the paradigm of termination scenarios, unable to conceptualize preparation for anything but expiration. They were watching a professional assume operational readiness while documenting what they believed to be ceremonial resignation. What their instruments failed to capture was the minute activation of subcutaneous systems, the quiet hum of nanotechnology coming online, the strategic assessment of environmental conditions. Wade's eyes tracked the closing exterior hatch with the focused attention of a specialist monitoring deployment parameters. His breathing pattern shifted to a measured rhythm that optimized oxygen utilization, a technique developed for extended vacuum operations. The scientists saw a captive facing execution. They were actually observing a deep space operative finalizing mission preparations. The chamber completed its sealing sequence with a final hydraulic hiss, the sound of absolute isolation achieved. On the observation deck, researchers adjusted their monitors and prepared data recording protocols. They anticipated the familiar sequence of biological failure, the gasping, the convulsions, the rapid shutdown of vital functions. Their entire attention focused on documenting how Wade would die. They never considered they might be about to witness how he operated. The vacuum beyond that transparisteel barrier wasn't a death sentence to him. It was a tactical environment. The ejection chamber wasn't his tomb. It was his launch tube. He stood exactly where he needed to be, waiting for the conditions that would initiate his actual purpose aboard their vessel. The initial moments in the vacuum played out exactly as the Nexus Prime team expected. Wade tumbled away from the ship's hull in a slow, uncontrolled rotation, his limbs drifting in the weightless environment, exactly like the 4712 previous subjects they'd observed. The scientists noted the familiar trajectory pattern in their logs, already preparing the standard analysis templates for biological failure documentation. Senior researcher Zil Mora observed the expected loss of consciousness markers at the 14-second mark, exactly on schedule according to their predictive models. Everything proceeded with the comforting predictability of a laboratory demonstration they'd witnessed hundreds of times before. Then, at precisely 37 seconds, the tumbling ceased. Not gradually, not through natural drift into stillness, but with the abrupt precision of a switch being flipped. Wade's body oriented itself toward the research vessel with unnatural stability, his limbs settling into a relaxed but purposeful position. In the absolute silence of the void, his form became the only fixed reference point against the star-dusted blackness, a still image in a universe of motion. The researchers initially assumed instrument error, running diagnostics on their tracking systems before realizing the impossibility before them was genuine. The expected biological collapse never materialized. No boiling fluids erupted from his eyes or mouth. No capillaries burst across his skin. No convulsions racked his frame. His body maintained perfect integrity, despite the vacuum that should have torn him apart at the cellular level. The data stream, which should have shown flatlining vital signs by this point, instead began displaying erratic spikes across multiple sensor arrays. His heart rate maintained its steady rhythm. His neural activity showed patterns of conscious awareness. His cellular integrity readings remained stable. The instruments designed to document death were instead recording something far more unsettling: thriving biological function. The control room fell into a silence deeper than the vacuum outside their hull. Researchers stared at their displays with the confused intensity of people witnessing physics itself being rewritten before their eyes. What they were observing wasn't just survival against odds. It was mastery of environment. The 37-second mark became not a point of expiration, but a point of activation, the moment when Wade stopped pretending to follow their expected narrative and began demonstrating his own capabilities. Their carefully constructed experiment had ended the second he decided to stop playing along with their assumptions. The resolution came not through their sensors, but through simple observation. Wade wasn't just surviving the vacuum, he was assessing it, his eyes scanning the research vessel with clear intentionality. The shocking realization wasn't that survival was possible, but that it was deliberate. His presence in the void wasn't accidental tolerance but conscious utilization. Their experiment to document death had instead become the opening act of his demonstration of capability. They had set out to study termination, and instead found themselves witnessing commencement. Their science had measured its last fatality. His technology was just beginning its showcase. The control panels across the Nexus Prime's observation deck began displaying readings so absurd that the scientists initially assumed widespread instrument failure. Energy signatures flared across every electromagnetic band simultaneously, a phenomenon they'd only previously observed during catastrophic reactor breaches or nearby supernovae. The senior technicians ran immediate diagnostics, their fingers flying across touchscreens as they searched for the supposed sensor malfunction. The systems reported perfect functionality, even as they displayed impossible data, creating a cognitive dissonance that left the research team staring at their screens in bewildered silence. The energy readings weren't merely elevated, they defied geometric progression models that had governed their understanding of biological limits for centuries. Wade's electromagnetic signature spiked by a factor they initially calculated as 12,000, a number so improbable that 3 separate scientists recalculated it independently before accepting the result. This wasn't energy leakage or environmental interference. The source was unmistakably the floating human figure outside their viewport, radiating power that should have vaporized any organic being instantly. Their instruments, designed to measure the faint biological energies of dying specimens, were suddenly overwhelmed by output levels comparable to a military-grade reactor. A blue-white radiance enveloped Wade's form, so intense that it cast sharp, distinct shadows across the research vessel's hull despite the absence of any external light source. The illumination seemed to emanate from within his very cells, a cool, controlled emission that transformed his silhouette into something decidedly non-biological. Space around his body appeared to warp slightly, the starfield behind him distorting as if viewed through heated air. The effect created a visible boundary where normal physics ended, and something entirely new began, a perceptual rift that made several researchers question their visual acuity. The power output metrics scrolling across their displays reached levels that defied rational explanation. Wade was generating sufficient energy to power a medium-sized city, all emanating from a form that their scans had previously identified as standard human biology. This wasn't some temporary surge or death throw explosion. The energy signature maintained stable, controlled output resembling a well-regulated power plant. Their earlier scans had missed the fundamental truth because they were looking for biological systems, not technological ones integrated at the cellular level. The resolution came not through their instruments but through simple observation of the energy's behavior. The radiation patterns showed purposeful modulation, shifting frequencies with intentional precision rather than random emission. The blue-white glow pulsed in rhythmic sequences that suggested communication or system checks rather than uncontrolled output. His body wasn't failing under the vacuum's assault. It was activating systems that redefined their understanding of what a biological organism could contain. The energy wasn't some desperate emergency response. It was the normal operation of technology so advanced it had become indistinguishable from biology itself. Their subject wasn't dying in the vacuum. He was powering up. Junior researcher Crixmole was the first to voice what the entire team had been silently dismissing as impossible. His theory emerging not as a confident declaration, but as the reluctant admission of someone whose scientific training conflicted with the evidence before him. He suggested active nanomachines, the words hanging in the control room's tense atmosphere like a heresy against established biological doctrine. His colleagues initially dismissed the concept as science fiction nonsense, the kind of speculation that might entertain first-year students, but had no place in serious research. Their instrumentation wasn't designed to detect technology operating at the cellular level, because their entire framework assumed such Integration was theoretically impossible. What they gradually came to understand wasn't mere augmentation but something far more radical, a complete biological restructuring occurring in real time. The nanomachines weren't just reinforcing Wade's existing biology, they were actively rewriting it moment by moment to suit environmental conditions. They monitored pressure differentials across every cell membrane, preventing tissue damage not through reinforcement, but through instantaneous cellular adaptation. His cells maintained structural integrity by becoming temporarily more flexible, then returning to normal parameters once the external threat passed. This wasn't protection, it was transformation. The systems managed metabolic processes with efficiency that made their own life support technology seem primitive by comparison. The machines recycled waste products into usable energy, created closed-loop systems for oxygen utilization, and maintained thermal regulation without external inputs. They didn't just help Wade survive the vacuum, they made the vacuum irrelevant as an environmental factor. His body operated with the self-contained efficiency of a deep space probe, only far more advanced than any technology the Nexus Prime team had ever encountered. Most critically, the nanomachines performed continuous consciousness preservation, maintaining neural function through methods that defied their understanding of neurobiology. They prevented the oxygen deprivation that should have caused almost immediate brain death, managed intracranial pressure fluctuations, and even appeared to enhance cognitive processing during the transition. Wade wasn't just remaining conscious. His mental faculties were operating at levels their scanners indicated were actually elevated from his baseline readings aboard their ship. This wasn't survival mode. It was optimized performance mode. These weren't commercial enhancement packages or medical rehabilitation systems. The scanning data revealed military-grade encryption protocols, non-standard energy signatures, and design architectures that matched no known manufacturer patterns. His triple-density bone structure, which they'd initially noted as an interesting physiological anomaly, now appeared as merely the most visible manifestation of much deeper modifications. The reinforced skeletal framework was just the structural support for systems that transformed a human body into something else entirely, a purpose-built environmental adaptation platform. The resolution gradually dawned on the research team as they pieced together the scanning data. Wade represented something their science had never contemplated, a biological being that had been deliberately engineered to overcome environmental limitations rather than adapt to them. Humanity hadn't evolved for space travel. They had rebuilt themselves for it. Their subject wasn't a specimen demonstrating survival against odds. He was a demonstration of a species that had looked at the harshness of space and decided to redesign themselves until it became comfortable. The vacuum wasn't a death sentence to beings like Wade. It was a preferred working environment. He hadn't been born for the void. His species had built him for it. The silent ballet that followed provided the final confirmation that what they were witnessing was neither accident nor anomaly. Wade began to move through the vacuum with a grace that made their earlier assumptions seem embarrassingly primitive. His motion bore no resemblance to the desperate flailing they'd documented in other species during their final moments. Instead, he executed precise movements that suggested complete mastery of his environment, his body arcing through the void with the fluid elegance of a swimmer in calm waters. The energy discharges that had so baffled their instruments now revealed their purpose. They weren't just power sources, but propulsion mechanisms and attitude control systems. He manipulated the electromagnetic emissions with conscious intent, creating subtle pushes and counter-pushes that allowed him to maneuver without physical contact points. His hands carved through the emptiness as if gathering invisible currents, his legs executing gentle kicks that produced measurable changes in velocity and direction. This wasn't the random drifting of a corpse or the panicked thrashing of a dying being. It was navigation, pure and simple, conducted with the confidence of someone following well-practiced procedures. The research team watched in stunned silence as he demonstrated mobility principles that contradicted 3 centuries of established physics. The most unnerving aspect was his complete lack of struggle. Where every other subject had fought fruitlessly against the vacuum's indifferent physics, Wade moved with it, through it, as part of it. His interactions with the void suggested an understanding of physical laws they hadn't yet discovered, a relationship with emptiness that transformed it from hostile environment to useful medium. He wasn't surviving despite the vacuum. He was utilizing it as a navigational space, his body interacting with forces their sensors couldn't even detect. The display of control was so absolute it rendered their concept of mobility obsolete. He oriented himself toward the Nexus Prime with deliberate precision, his trajectory carrying him toward the observation deck viewport, as if approaching a designated docking point. The scientists could only watch, their reference materials offering no framework for what unfolded before them. Textbooks filled with equations about momentum conservation and Newtonian physics sat useless on their datapads while a human demonstrated mobility systems that defied all established rules. Their ship, with its complex thrusters and navigation computers, suddenly appeared clumsy and inefficient compared to this single being moving under his own power. The resolution came not through instrumentation, but through simple observation of his effortless motion. Wade swam through the vacuum with the innate comfort of the aquatic creature returned to its native waters, each movement economical and purposeful. The void wasn't killing him, it was enabling him. Their massive research vessel, with all its technology and complexity, now appeared as what it truly was, a cumbersome life support capsule for beings who couldn't survive the environment outside. He moved with the ease of someone in their natural element, making their entire concept of space travel seem like a primitive attempt to bring a bubble of atmosphere along for the ride. The vacuum wasn't his executioner. It had become his ocean, and he was demonstrating just how thoroughly he belonged in it. The communications console aboard the Nexus Prime lit up with activity across every frequency simultaneously, a display of spectral occupation so complete it suggested massive equipment malfunction. Every channel, from emergency bands to research frequencies to encrypted administrative lines, carried the same transmission. The senior communications officer initially assumed a catastrophic system failure, or perhaps some bizarre stellar interference phenomenon. His diagnostics returned perfect system integrity, even as his displays showed the impossible. A signal occupying bandwidth that should have been physically impossible to broadcast across simultaneously. The source identification systems failed completely, unable to locate the origin point of the transmission that now controlled their entire communication spectrum. A calm, measured voice began speaking through every active speaker and headset aboard the research vessel, its tone carrying the patient clarity of an instructor beginning a well-rehearsed lesson. The audio quality was pristine, devoid of the static or distortion that should have accompanied any transmission from the vacuum outside their hull. The voice belonged to Wade, a fact that took several seconds to register with the stunned research team. Their initial confusion gave way to dawning comprehension as they realized the source wasn't somewhere aboard their ship, or even from a nearby vessel. The transmission originated from the human floating calmly in the vacuum beyond their viewport, a physical impossibility that their communication textbooks had no framework to explain. His nanomachine suite included a sophisticated communications array integrated at the cellular level, technology so advanced it made their own equipment seem primitive by comparison. These weren't external devices but biological modifications that allowed him to generate, modulate, and transmit signals across the electromagnetic spectrum, using his own body as both power source and antenna. He wasn't merely talking to them. He had seamlessly hijacked their entire communications infrastructure, bypassing encryption protocols and security firewalls with effortless ease. Their systems, designed to prevent unauthorized access, now served as his personal amplification network. Wade explained his capabilities with the methodical patience of someone delivering a technical briefing, his voice remaining utterly calm despite the extraordinary circumstances. He described his control over electromagnetic fields within a 50-kilometer radius, a range that conveniently encompassed their entire research vessel and then some. His explanation wasn't boastful or threatening but matter-of-fact, the tone of a professional detailing system specifications to new users. He could manipulate their sensors, override their security barriers, and control their communications, not through brute force hacking but through fundamental mastery of the electromagnetic spectrum itself. Their laboratory had ceased to be a controlled environment the moment he decided to stop being its subject. Every instrument, every barrier, every communication channel now answered to his will rather than theirs. The researchers watched their own displays show data he chose to provide, listened to communications he allowed to occur, observed readings he permitted them to see. The power dynamic had shifted completely without a single shot fired or barrier breached. His control was so absolute, it felt less like a takeover and more like a demonstration of how things should properly function. The resolution became clear through his calm explanation of capabilities. Wade was communicating not because he needed to, but because he chose to demonstrate that his apparent isolation was an illusion. Floating in the vacuum, he remained more connected to their systems than they were themselves. His transmission served as the final proof that their concept of containment had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. They had believed they controlled the environment while studying their subject. In reality, their subject had been studying them while allowing them to believe they controlled anything at all. Their laboratory wasn't a research facility anymore. It had become his demonstration platform, and they were both the audience and the exhibits. Wade oriented himself toward the main observation viewport, executing the maneuver with the casual precision of someone approaching a familiar doorway rather than floating in hard vacuum. His motion carried none of the urgency or desperation the scientists expected from a being who should have been minutes from expiration. He simply drifted closer until he filled their main screen, his expression maintaining that same calm amusement that had unnerved them from the beginning. The researchers watched in confused silence, their hands frozen above control panels designed for scenarios that no longer applied to the situation developing before them. He reached out with his right hand, a gesture so fundamentally human it seemed absurd in the context of their sterile laboratory and his vacuum environment. His fingers extended toward the reinforced transparasteel barrier that separated him from the controlled atmosphere of their observation deck. The material was rated to withstand micrometeorite impacts at orbital velocities, engineered to maintain integrity under pressures that would crush lesser alloys. Their security protocols treated this viewport as a permanent boundary, an absolute division between the deadly void outside and the life-sustaining environment within. Their entire safety methodology depended on such barriers remaining inviolate. Where his fingertips met the surface, the expected collision never occurred. Instead, the metal began to glow with the same blue-white energy that surrounded his body, the radiance spreading from the point of contact in intricate patterns that resembled circuitry, more than structural failure. The material didn't crack or fracture under stress. It transformed at a fundamental level, its atomic structure rewriting itself according to commands their instruments couldn't detect. The reinforced barrier became transparent, then malleable, then something entirely new that their science had no classification for. It flowed like liquid metal while maintaining structural integrity, reshaping itself according to principles that defied material science. He wasn't forcing his way through the barrier so much as convincing it to become something else entirely. The ship's own security systems, designed to prevent unauthorized access, instead facilitated his entry by redefining what constituted a barrier versus an entrance. Their impregnable hull became permeable not through destruction but through reconfiguration. The technology that should have kept him out instead welcoming him in. The scientists could only watch as their strongest physical defense became his preferred entry point, the transformation occurring with such seamless precision that it suggested this was the material's intended function all along. The resolution became apparent through the sheer effortless quality of the transformation. Wade didn't need to be granted entry because he carried the means to create entry wherever he chose. Their concept of barriers as physical impediments had been fundamentally naive, a primitive understanding of containment that his technology treated as mildly amusing. The strongest materials in their arsenal became temporary suggestions rather than absolute obstacles, their physical properties subject to revision by systems they couldn't perceive until they manifested. Their security protocols had been designed around the assumption that walls would remain walls and doors would remain doors. His presence demonstrated that such distinctions were merely preferences, and his preferences carried considerably more weight than theirs. The viewport completed its transformation into something between a doorway and a metaphysical concept, its edges maintaining perfect seal integrity, even as its center became permeable. Atmosphere didn't scream into the vacuum, because the transition point maintained pressure differentials through methods their instruments couldn't decipher. The blue-white energy pulsed gently, marking the boundary between environments without actually separating them. Their laboratory's most secure barrier had become his personal entrance, redefining their understanding of both security and accessibility in the process. The scientists realized with dawning horror that their entire concept of containment had been built on assumptions his technology treated as charmingly antiquated. The moment of re-entry unfolded with an almost disappointing simplicity that made the Nexus Prime's elaborate security measures seem suddenly foolish. Wade stepped through the transformed section of the hull as casually as a commuter passing through a sliding door, his movement devoid of any strain or theatricality. There was no violent breach, no explosive decompression, no emergency alarms blaring through the corridors. The atmosphere within the laboratory remained perfectly stable, the pressure differentials managed with such localized precision that not a single air molecule escaped into the vacuum beyond. The scientists watched in stunned disbelief as their most fundamental assumption about environmental containment was quietly invalidated by a man who treated solid metal as a temporary suggestion rather than a physical law. He stood fully inside the observation deck, the barrier behind him resealing itself with the seamless finality of water closing over a swimmer. The metal returned to its original state without so much as a seam or discoloration, leaving no evidence that it had ever been anything other than an impregnable wall. The entire process occurred with such understated efficiency that it felt less like a breach of security and more like a demonstration of how things ought to properly function. His first words were a dry, understated observation delivered in the same calm tone he'd used throughout his captivity. Much better. The statement carried none of the triumph or threat they might have expected from someone who had just rewritten their understanding of physics. The simple phrase wasn't about comfort or atmospheric preference, but something far more profound: the complete dissolution of the boundary between biological need and technological capability. His comment acknowledged the laboratory's environment not as an improvement over the vacuum, but as a different set of parameters that his systems could accommodate with equal ease. He had rendered their entire containment paradigm obsolete, not through force or destruction, but through a fundamental redefinition of what containment meant. Their security protocols, designed around the concept of keeping things separate, had just encountered a being for whom separation was an optional state rather than an absolute condition. He walked through solid metal because his technology treated material states as adjustable variables rather than fixed properties. His systems interacted with matter at a subatomic level, convincing atoms to rearrange themselves according to his needs, rather than their inherent characteristics. The hull wasn't breached so much as temporarily persuaded to become something else, its transformation so complete and controlled that it maintained structural integrity throughout the process. Their strongest barriers had become situational rather than absolute, their permanence revealed as merely a matter of perspective. The resolution lay in the utter normality of his demeanor as he stood surveying the laboratory. He hadn't just survived the void. He had internalized its logic to such a degree that he could bring that same functionality indoors. The vacuum's absence of atmosphere, its lack of pressure, its silence, all became qualities he could manifest within their controlled environment through his technology. Their laboratory, designed to keep the void out, now contained a being who carried the void's possibilities within him. He had not only demonstrated his ability to survive their execution attempt, but had shown that their concept of execution was based on limitations his species had long since moved beyond. The step through solid metal was merely the physical manifestation of a conceptual leap they were only beginning to comprehend. The long-range sensors showed nothing but empty space and background static, their displays stubbornly blank as if suffering some widespread technical malfunction. Senior Technician Malkren ran 3 separate diagnostic cycles, each confirming the systems operated at optimal efficiency despite their apparent failure to detect the impossible. The screen showed serene starfields and the comforting emptiness of well-charted space, a visual representation of the universe they believed they understood. Then the visual displays flickered to life, rendering the sensor data irrelevant with 6 silent arrivals that defied every detection protocol in their operational manuals. 6 cruisers hung in the void beyond the observation deck, their sudden presence so visually jarring that several researchers initially assumed they were experiencing mass hallucinations brought on by stress. The vessels hadn't emerged from FTL with the characteristic energy signatures or spatial distortions. They hadn't approached on sublight engines, leaving telltale drive emissions across the electromagnetic spectrum. They simply occupied space that had been empty moments before. Their appearance so seamless it suggested they'd been there all along, patiently waiting to be noticed. Their positioning formed a perfect tactical formation around the Nexus Prime, an arrangement that spoke of military precision rather than accidental arrival. The ship designs bore no resemblance to anything in the galactic databases, their architecture suggesting a completely different technological lineage than any known spacefaring civilization. Sleek and angular with surfaces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, they projected an aura of quiet power that made the research vessel suddenly appear clumsy and outdated. Their silent presence felt more like a judgment than a visitation, a physical manifestation of capabilities the Nexus team could scarcely comprehend. There were no visible weapon ports, no obvious engine nacelles, no standard communication arrays, just clean lines and unsettling stillness. The comm system chimed with the same polite tone it used for internal messages, the display identifying the source as Terran Naval Division Escort Group. The request for permission to come aboard carried the formal cadence of diplomatic protocol, though the context rendered the formality almost absurd. The message wasn't transmitted through normal channels but appeared simultaneously on every screen and communication device aboard the ship, bypassing their security systems as easily as Wade had bypassed their physical barriers. This was the tangible proof of everything their captive envoy had explained, delivered with understated finality. Their technology represented something far beyond mere stealth or cloaking devices. The human vessels hadn't avoided detection. They had manipulated the very physics of sensor operation, controlling what could be perceived and when. Their appearance wasn't the result of arriving, but of choosing to become visible, a demonstration of control over reality perception that made their own scientific understanding seem primitive by comparison. The power dynamic shifted not through threats or demonstrations of force, but through the quiet confidence of beings who operated on principles the research team couldn't even detect, let alone comprehend. The 6 cruisers maintained their formation with perfect stability, their presence rewriting the rules of engagement without firing a single shot or issuing a single ultimatum. They had appeared because they decided to be seen, because their demonstration required witnesses who understood the implications of their capabilities. The Nexus Prime's research mission had ended the moment their instruments became irrelevant to the reality unfolding around them. Their science had measured everything except the possibility that someone might have learned to measure better. Wade's demeanor underwent a subtle but unmistakable shift from exhibit to educator as he stood surveying the stunned research team. His posture relaxed into something approaching academic informality, the kind of stance a professor might assume before delivering a particularly insightful lecture. He began explaining the root of their error not with triumph or condescension, but with the clear, methodical patience of someone correcting a fundamental misunderstanding in basic principles. His tone carried no gloating, only the steady cadence of revelation delivered to an audience that suddenly realized how much they had misunderstood. He identified their classic blind spot with surgical precision, the automatic equation of newness to the galactic community with primitiveness. Their civilization had encountered humanity relatively recently, compared to other spacefaring species, a chronological accident they had interpreted as developmental delay. They assumed that less time in the interstellar community meant less advanced technology, less sophisticated biology, less understanding of universal laws. This assumption had colored their entire approach to studying him, leading them to interpret his calm demeanor as ignorance rather than capability, his composure as primitive acceptance rather than professional readiness. Humanity had simply chosen a different evolutionary pathway, a conscious one that prioritized biological adaptability over technological externalization. Where other species built better ships and better suits to survive harsh environments, humans had taken the more direct approach of rebuilding themselves to thrive in those environments. Their assumption that biological constraints were universal laws nobody could break reflected a failure of imagination more than a failure of science. Humanity hadn't broken those constraints. They had systematically rewritten them through generations of intentional self-modification, treating their own biology as technology to be improved rather than limitations to be accepted. His presence aboard their vessel wasn't accidental capture but deliberate reconnaissance, a first contact mission conducted by a new type of envoy, who didn't require the traditional diplomatic trappings of ships and emissaries and formal introductions. The humans they would meet next wouldn't arrive in starships because they no longer needed them for interstellar travel. Their evolution had progressed to the point where the distinction between vessel and passenger had become irrelevant, where the biological could incorporate what other species needed to build around themselves. His demonstration hadn't been about showing what one human could survive, but what his entire species had become. The resolution came not as a threat but as a warning about the dangers of assumptions in a universe far more complex than their models accounted for. Their scientific certainty had become a vulnerability, a cognitive blind spot that could get them killed when encountering beings who operated outside their established frameworks. They weren't dealing with primitive primates who had stumbled into space travel through luck and ambition. They were facing a conscious evolution that had looked at the universe's limitations and decided to redesign itself until those limitations became features rather than obstacles. His presence wasn't an anomaly to be studied, but a preview of what happened when a species stopped adapting to environments and started incorporating them. Wade's tone shifted, subtly from educator to something more serious, the academic patience giving way to the grim focus of a soldier delivering an intelligence briefing. The demonstration was over. The lesson was just beginning. He explained that the universe they thought they understood, the carefully mapped star lanes, the documented species, the predictable physics was merely the surface layer of something far older and infinitely more dangerous. Their scientific models had been measuring the visible cosmos while entirely missing what lay beneath, like cartographers meticulously mapping coastline details while ignoring the ocean depths teeming with predators. He described entities in the deep dark that had slept for millions of years, ancient forces that predated their civilization, their species, even their star system. These weren't merely advanced aliens or unknown species, but something fundamentally different, operating on scales that made galactic empires look like temporary patterns in sand. Their awakening had begun, triggered by energy signatures emanating from emerging technologies across the galaxy. The Nexus Prime's own research, their experiments, their energy emissions, all were like tiny sparks in a dry forest, potentially drawing attention from things that should have been left undisturbed. His own display of power, which had so stunned the research team, was merely a minor flicker compared to what humanity had detected moving in the darkness between galaxies. The energy signatures they'd monitored from his body represented a fraction of what these ancient entities could generate casually, like comparing a candle flame to a supernova. Humanity's rapid technological advancement hadn't been driven by curiosity or ambition alone, but by necessity, a desperate race to prepare for threats their earliest deep space probes had detected on the cosmic horizon. Their project of biological transformation wasn't about convenience but survival, an attempt to evolve into something that might withstand what was coming. The research team's peaceful corner of the universe was an illusion maintained by their limited perception, a temporary quietude that was ending as older things began to stir from their long slumber. Their science had been measuring the pond while predators stirred in the ocean beyond, their instruments too primitive to detect the disturbances moving through deeper waters. Wade's presence represented humanity's attempt to sound a warning to civilizations still operating under dangerous assumptions about cosmic safety. Their belief in predictable physics and containable threats had become a liability in a universe containing forces that treated galaxies as temporary arrangements of matter. The resolution settled over the control room with the weight of shattered certainties. Their experiment to study a single human's death had instead revealed that death might be coming for everyone on a scale they couldn't comprehend. The comfortable certainty of their research protocols, their biological laws, their understanding of cosmic dangers, all had been rendered obsolete in a few minutes of demonstration and explanation. They had been measuring atmospheric pressure, while the hurricane gathered force beyond their instruments' range. Their science had documented 4,912 deaths in vacuum, while missing the single important truth that some beings had evolved beyond death's reach because they had to. Because what was coming would make vacuum exposure seem trivial. The universe wasn't the safe laboratory they'd assumed, and humanity wasn't the primitive species they'd categorized. Both truths arrived simultaneously, leaving them with the uncomfortable realization that their research had been focusing on the wrong questions entirely. You think you know what fear looks like? Try being a maintenance engineer staring down an alien hunter who just breached your station's hull without breaking stride. This predator called Razak treats humans like prey, and he already knows everything about my kids. You know that feeling when your long-range sensors pick up something that shouldn't be there? That little blip that makes your coffee suddenly taste like static and regret. Jake Morrison was elbow-deep in a faulty oxygen recycler when his comms crackled to life. Just another Tuesday on Kepler Station, grease on his hands thinking about what to make the kids for dinner. Then the alarm started, not the standard proximity alert, but the deep system ping that means something's bypassing all the usual protocols. The ship didn't drift. It didn't coast. It moved like a shark circling a seal colony, all tight arcs and predatory grace. No known vessel handles like that. Morrison wiped his hands on his overalls and called up to control. Krim, the xenobiology specialist on duty, was already running the numbers. His voice came back tight, professional, but with that edge you get when the universe suddenly stops making sense. Negative probability of mechanical failure, he said. Maneuvering precision suggests deliberate control, high confidence. This wasn't some lost freighter or damaged probe. The pattern was reconnaissance, methodical, hunting. While command was still debating comms protocols, the outer airlock cycled open without authorization. No request for docking clearance, no identification signature. Just the slow, hydraulic hiss of a door that wasn't supposed to open. The figure that stepped through stood 7 feet tall and carried himself like he owned the vacuum. He didn't wear a standard suit, just sleek dark armor that seemed to drink the light. "I am Razak of the Kithran hunting clans," he said, his voice a low frequency that vibrated in your bones. "Your species designation is human. No hello, no pleasantries, just a statement of fact like a chef identifying ingredients. First contact scenarios usually involve awkward hand gestures and gift exchanges. This was different." Razak scanned the corridor with glowing eyes that missed nothing, the slight tremor in the junior tech's hands, the way Morrison shifted his weight, the distant sound of children laughing from the residential wing. He already knew everything about them, their biology, their psychology, their weaknesses. He wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to hunt. The Galactic Hunter had arrived, and he treated humans like prey. Which brings us to how a maintenance engineer becomes the first line of defense when everything with a rank and a uniform is suddenly scrambling for protocols that don't exist. So what do you do when an alien hunter knows everything about your kids? Razak didn't just see Morrison as prey. He saw him as a parent. That's worse. He tilted his head, those glowing eyes narrowing, and said 5 words that turned the station cold. "The Cubs make better sport." Not a threat, not a boast. Just a casual observation like noting the weather. He knew about Emma's art project on the kitchen table, about Leo's fear of the dark, about the way Morrison's pulse quickened when he thought about them. This hunter didn't need weapons to terrify. He used psychology like a scalpel. Most commanders would have done the textbook thing. Lock down the residential wing, hunker down, protect the vulnerable. Standard procedure. But Morrison was an engineer, not a soldier. He thought in systems, in cause and effect. Hiding his kids made them targets. It turned them into prizes waiting to be claimed. But luring Razak away, that created opportunity. It turned a defensive nightmare into a game of movement in space. He tapped his comm, 3 quick pulses, then 2 slow. Emergency Protocol 7. A family code they'd practiced on lazy Sundays, back when the biggest emergency was burned toast. It meant get to the safe room, stay quiet, don't open the door for anyone but Dad. But that was only half the plan. The safe room was a temporary solution. Razak would find it eventually. The real strategy was simpler and far more dangerous. Morrison had to make himself the most interesting thing on the station. He let his hands shake. He backed away from Razak, stumbling over a tool crate he knew was there. He made his breath come in short, panicked gasps. But underneath the performance, his mind was already mapping routes, calculating angles, remembering every maintenance hatch and power conduit between here and the mining bay. He had to be scared, enough to be believable, but clever enough to stay alive. Too much fear, and Razak would lose interest. Too little, and he'd suspect a trap. The predator smiled, a thin, cruel line across his face. "This should be entertaining," he said, and took a step forward. Morrison didn't wait. He turned and ran, not toward command, not toward security, but deeper into the station's industrial sectors. He didn't look back, but he knew Razak was following. The hunter's footsteps were silent, but the air itself seemed to pull taut behind him. That was the moment the engineer decided to rewrite the rules of the hunt. He wasn't trying to win a fight. He was trying to win a game of distraction. Every second he kept Razak chasing him was a second his kids were safe. Every corridor he led him down was one farther from the residential wing. He became the bait, the diversion, the flickering light that held the predator's attention, and Razak, confident in his superiority, took the chase. He saw a frightened animal running for its life. He didn't see the calculations running behind the fear. He didn't see the father who knew every bolt and wire of this station, who was about to turn his own home into a hunting ground of a very different kind. I mean, how do you fake panic for a hunter who can probably smell your adrenaline? Morrison's heart hammered against his ribs like it wanted out, but he let it. He didn't try to calm himself. He leaned into the fear, amped it up, turned his own biology into part of the act. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Real sweat, not synthetic. His breath came in ragged, airy hitches. To Razak, it must have looked like pure primal terror, the perfect picture of prey. But under the surface, Morrison's mind was a control room. Cold, clear, calm. Every stumble was placed. Every gasp was timed. He made sure to clip his shoulder against a bulkhead, not hard enough to slow him down, just enough to sell the idea of a man too scared to watch where he was going. He let a wrench slip from his belt and clatter loudly down a service shaft. A nice auditory breadcrumb for the hunter to follow. All theater. All for show. The tension here was surgical. One wrong step, a hesitation a half-second too long, a glance toward the residential wing, even a poorly timed breath, and it wouldn't just be him bleeding out on the deck plates. Razak would know. He'd pivot, lose interest in the bait, and go straight for what he really wanted. The cubs. Morrison's performance wasn't just about staying alive. It was about keeping a monster's attention perfectly, dangerously fixed on him alone. He leaned hard into the stereotype, the frantic civilian, the panicked engineer. He muttered half-formed pleas to himself, just loud enough to be picked up by Razak's enhanced hearing. Oh God, not like this. Classic prey behavior. Exactly what the hunter's profile of humanity would expect. But while his mouth babbled nonsense, his eyes were constantly moving, flicking to access panels, memorizing junction numbers, tracing the faint scuff marks on the floor that only he knew led to shortcuts. He thought of the old fable Emma loved, the three little pigs. He wasn't the pig that built his house of straw or sticks. He was the one who built with bricks, the smart pig, the one who knew the wolf was coming and prepared for it. He wasn't going to outfight a Kitharan hunter. That was a suicide mission. He was going to outthink him. The goal wasn't to be stronger, it was to be smarter, and Razak bought it. All of it. His confidence was a tangible thing, a smug pressure in the air that grew with every frantic stumble Morrison took. The hunter's footsteps, still eerily silent, followed at a leisurely pace. He wasn't in a rush. Why would he be? He was tracking a broken man, not a strategist. He believed he was witnessing the final, pathetic flight of a creature that knew it was doomed. The thrill was in the chase, not the conclusion, which he already considered a foregone conclusion. The resolution was in the distance Morrison created. With every shambling, terrified step, he led Razak deeper into the industrial belly of Kepler Station. Farther from the residential sectors, farther from his kids. He turned the raw animal emotion of fear into a functional tool, a weapon of distraction. He bought them time with his performance, and he bought himself space with his route. Meanwhile, the hunter followed the trail of sound and scent, completely unaware that the prey was setting the pace. He didn't see the calculations. He saw the fear. He heard the panic. He smelled the sweat. For a creature that prided itself on reading its quarry, Razak was, for perhaps the first time in his long career, reading exactly what he was supposed to see. A perfect illusion, a masterpiece of misdirection painted in human terror. And he followed it step by deliberate step deeper into the maze.